Hi everyone. In today's class, we're going to look at DNA packaging. Last class, we looked at DNA structure and we figured out that DNA is like a ladder, okay, a double helix that's joined together by nitrogenous bases. Now, in terms of how this molecule is packaged, this DNA molecule is wrapped around these tiny proteins called histone proteins, which act as physical anchors for DNA to be wrapped around. Now, the reason why this is done is to help DNA condense, into a chromosome. So when you look at a chromosome and the classic X shape that it's in, that is literally made up of millions of histone proteins that are all coiled around to form that kind of structure. And then around all those histone proteins, you have DNA molecules, again, tightly wrapped around to those protein molecules. So ultimately, when you look at a chromosome, you're basically looking at a single DNA molecule. Okay. All of your chromosomes can be found inside a nucleus, which is usually the largest organelle of a cell. So every single body cell that you have, that we call somatic cells, okay, so every single body cell, except for your sex cells, sperm and egg, there are 46 thread-like molecules of DNA. And therefore, in humans, you have 46 chromosomes. Now, as we've looked at in the previous unit, each one of these chromosomes have many different sections to them, called genes. So if we look at a particular gene, all we would find is a certain section of the DNA molecule. That's all it is. There's nothing very special about that particular section, other than the fact that it's carrying a very specific set of information or instructions on how to build a certain part of your body. So every gene contains DNA sequences for a physical trait. Now, it doesn't have to be a physical trait like eye color, hair color, but each one of those traits, like in order to get a certain eye color, you have to have certain pigment proteins, for example. So DNA also gives the instructions on how to build these proteins or hormones or enzymes or any other biological chemical that your body might need in order to function properly. So that's why we think of DNA as your ultimate set of blueprints. It will create everything from how your bones are structured together, to the very fabric of how certain types of hormones might interact with those structures and sequences. So everything there is to know about you is literally coded in your DNA sequences. That sequence, therefore, is called the genetic code. So similar to a computer, you need a programmer to input a series of codes in order for it to be able to do anything. This is what your DNA does for you. Your DNA is the actual code that your cells will have to read in order to figure out what to do. So if you think about a single strand of DNA, on a single strand of DNA, if this sequence here is the genetic code for something, then it's written out as ATAGCAATTCGA. It may not seem like there's some kind of message embedded in this code, but that's because right now we don't know how to read it properly. We don't know what this code actually means. However, what we can do is use Chargaff's rule. Okay, and we can use Chargaff's rules to figure out the DNA strand, or at least the DNA sequence, in your second strand of DNA. Okay, so once you've copied the code down, pause the video and try to figure out what the code is on the second strand. All right, if you figured it out, okay, A always pairs up with T, T pairs up with A, G pairs up with C, and of course C will pair up with any G. That's Chargaff's rule. This should be the sequence that you get. This is what we call the complementary sequence on the complementary strand. Complementary just means matching. So what we have here is a second DNA strand that, even though it is composed of different nitrogenous bases, it still contains exactly the same information that's in the first strand. So it's almost like a backup. But later on, we'll actually realize that it's more than a backup. Okay? DNA exists as a double helix mainly because of how it can make another copy of itself. Okay, and that's the genius of this particular helical shape. But again, we'll discuss that in the next couple of lessons. Okay. What I want you to think about is genetics. Okay, your entire body, it's like a book. Okay, so if all the genetic material that makes up you is like information inside a book, okay, then basically you are a book, and the genome represents you as the entire book. But when you start to dissect all the various parts of the book, okay, this is how we can compare the different components of genetics to a book. The pages basically represents the chromosomes. Okay, so for a human book, it would have 46 pages because there are 46 chromosomes. But if you were to examine each page, you would find paragraphs. Just like if you were to examine each chromosome, you would find genes. So the paragraphs are genes. When you look at the paragraphs more closely, you'll find sentences. Okay? These sentences basically represent genetic sequences. And when you examine the genetic sequences, okay, or these sentences, you will find letters. Okay? They're made up of letters. But in genetics, the sequence itself is only made up of 4 repeating letters, A, C, T, and G, which represent your nitrogenous bases. So that's why when you compare the human genome, okay, to a book, you basically have this instruction manual in terms of how to build a proper human. And that's amazing, okay, because all it is just a series of 4 letters, okay, being repeated in a very specific way that has been coded in a very specific way, so that no matter who reads this book, they will know what to build and how to build it, and they will build it properly. So that is actually the most amazing thing about genetics, okay, and our current understanding of genetics.